Hi everyone, it's Professor Hull. Welcome back. So this week we are talking about style. I saved style until the end of this course, and I mentioned this with theme as well. One of the reasons that theme comes a little bit later, because these are more abstract concepts. Style I think of as a little bit slippery. There's a lot that is involved with style, and it's hard to understand style or develop your style as an author, as a writer, if you have not done some of the legwork first to take a look at those literary elements, the things that we've been talking about throughout the term. So you kind of have to have a good understanding of things like plot, characterization, setting, those basic building blocks before you can think about your style. So what exactly, I don't like that. What exactly goes into style? A number of things. We have, if I can get my keyboard adjusted here. One thing to think about is diction. So this is word choice. You can think of this also as the vocabulary you're using. Another is syntax. That's the word order, how you put those words together. Sentence structure, kind of going along with syntax. Literary devices. So those are things like simile, metaphor, alliteration. It's where you repeat the first word. Let me do square brackets. Luscious lilacs. Assonance. I'm having a difficult time typing here. There we go. That's when you repeat a vowel sound, typically in the middle of a word. So something like found a round house. Found and round rhyme, but house does not. Rhyming. Not always in fiction, maybe in some children's books. Some picture books can do this well and some do not, but if that's part of your style, what details, I'll just put etc. here, other literary devices, figurative language, those types of things. What details you choose to include, your subject matter, what genre, or rather here if you're looking at fiction, subgenre you're writing in. What I mean by that is that there are certain conventions of different genres. So if you think about some of the genres, Western, mystery, romance, science fiction, fantasy, science fantasy, those types of subgenres of literature. So if you look at mystery has a lot of subgenres that even come off of that. So we have noir, we have gritty detective stories, we have cozy mysteries, thrillers, historical, medical, the capers, suspense, science fiction mysteries where they kind of have a blending, romantic suspense. I talked earlier this term about someone who writes Christian or inspirational romantic suspense. That's a very niche category, right? So the thing about your subgenre is that there are certain conventions, certain things that you're going to kind of have to pay attention to and follow. So a cozy mystery typically features a female detective, amateur detective. She has a job or a hobby that is kind of quirky, I guess, a little bit, or makes her sort of different in some way. We have typically no blood, so the description of her finding the body is a little bit more gentle, and these are typically series of books where, for example, there are some for quilting. There are some for antiquing. There's one series where the woman is a chocolatier. There's another one where she runs a winery. There are several for people who do catering or baking, and that's their job. So you have more about a small town that she lives in, typically the quirky neighbors and things like that. And you're not going to have things like, she puts in a batch of cupcakes and then she comes out and someone has been eviscerated from throat to belly and their guts are falling out and there's blood all over the place. You're not going to have that, right? You're going to have her finding a body, and even if it's been stabbed, she'll just say, oh my, he's been stabbed. And also, my red velvet cupcakes are burning. That's what you'll have in that subgenre. Those are the conventions. So it'll add to your style a little bit. Whereas if you're writing a gritty detective novel that's maybe, like, let's say it's set in the 1800s, you're going to have period details. If it's historical, it's going to be quite dark. You're going to maybe go into unsavory places with your detective. They're going to talk to the criminals who are underground. The descriptions of the bodies that they find are going to be much more grotesquely detailed. So those kind of things will add to your style. And I mention it here because we have talked about some of these things as we've looked at our mentor texts, our short stories, as we've looked at our befores and afters, those creative writing samples, but we haven't really talked about genre that much, so I wanted to mention it here. But conventions of the genre or subgenre, what literary devices you're using, the details, the subject matter, things like pacing would also be a part of this. Your tone. So your tone is your attitude toward the subject, or if not your attitude, at least I should say the narrator's attitude toward the subject. And then kind of going along with that is mood, which is your effect on the reader's emotions. So sometimes people refer to this as the atmosphere created by the writer. The narrative voice that you choose, whether that is sort of going along with tone, I guess I should have put them together, but is it casual, serious, melodramatic, oblivious, suspicious, etc. That's going to add to that style. And quite frankly, I guess going along with pacing, the ways that you use and, for a lack of a better term, play with the elements of fiction. So setting, plot, characterization, conflict, etc., all those things we've been talking about throughout the term. The themes that you choose to focus on sort of goes up with that, but that's okay. I'll put it separately. So all of these things really can contribute to your style. And I know that this is a weird long list that has a number of different things in it. So what we're going to do in a moment is look at short excerpts from several different authors, and we'll talk about the styles that they're employing and what you can learn from them. So a little bit different in terms of our lecture today. And then after that, I will go over 6 tips for developing your own style. So considering all of this stuff, we're gonna look at some examples, and we'll go through not all of these for every single person, certainly, but we'll go through some of them for each person and talk about what they did. So here is an excerpt from Cormac McCarthy's book, The Road, and what you need to know going into this. So for context, this is the beginning. I think this is from the beginning of the book. It is about a man and a boy traveling together after an apocalyptic event. So the world is kind of broken apart, fragmented, and they have this sort of almost like a quest. So he stood and looked over the building, the pumps standing with their hoses oddly still in place, the windows intact. The door to the service bay was open and he went in. A standing metal toolbox against one wall. He went through the drawers, but there was nothing there he could use. Good half-inch drive sockets, a ratchet. He stood looking around the garage. A metal barrel full of trash. He went into the office, dust and ash everywhere. The boy stood in the door. A metal desk, a cash register, some old automotive manuals swollen and sodden. The linoleum was stained and curling from the leaking roof. He crossed to the desk and stood there. Then he picked up the phone and dialed the number of his father's house in that long ago. The boy watched him. So, what do we have here? In terms of style, we have a lot of sentence fragments. So, thinking about syntax, thinking about sentence structure, the window's intact. It's not a complete sentence. The pump standing, not a complete sentence. A standing metal toolbox. Good half-inch drive sockets. A ratchet. Both of those are incomplete sentences. Sentence fragments. Metal barrel full of trash. Dust and ash everywhere. A metal desk. A cash register. So we have... okay. In the yellow, we have a number of sentence fragments. Now, if that drives you crazy, don't read this book because they're everywhere in this book. But he's, I think, employing that and breaking the rules of standard written English because this is a world that has been torn apart. So his sentences are kind of torn apart as well. And as the man here walks through, sees these things, it's like glimpses of the old world left behind. Right? The hoses with the pumps are still there. Clearly this is a gas station, right? Or possibly mechanics that has some gas there. Metal toolbox, sockets, ratchet, trash, ash, dust. And he's kind of seeing these things, these fragments of the world, as it says here. I'll do this in green, in that long ago. Now, we have a rhythm here, which I don't think I mentioned in style, but I should have if I did not. I think sometimes of writing in style like music that you can have people writing in the same genre. We talked about mysteries, but there are many apocalyptic or post-apocalyptic tales. They're not all told the same way, right? So it's like listening to two different singers both sing the blues. They have their own guitar riffs. They have their own vocal runs. They have their own tone of voice. Maybe they slow things down or they speed things up. And the rhythm here is kind of short sentences, a few medium sentences, but a lot of these short sentence fragments, right? And the longest sentence, I think this one, whoops. Oh. Okay, sorry about that. There's a couple sort of medium-ish sentences, but there are not really that many, and this style, I don't want to jump ahead there, but yeah, I think what you can learn from him as an author. When do I use standard written English? When can I kind of break from that? How much can I break the rules of grammar and still have my story be understandable? How can I use a style that fits the story, that fits in with the themes, the message that I might be trying to convey to my readers? I think that you can see all of that going on in this in this sample. So we're going to switch to something totally different and look at a book that I maybe did not enjoy as much, but I think she's doing some interesting things here. So, Stephenie Meyer, New Moon. This is I think the second book in the Twilight series, and I have two little excerpts, and then we'll talk about both of them. So, time passes, even when it seems impossible, even when each tick of the second hand aches like the pulse of blood behind a bruise. It passes unevenly, in strange lurches and dragging lulls, but pass it does, even for me. We have tick of the second hand on the clock, aching like the pulse of blood behind a bruise. So we have a simile there. We also have blood. This is a book about vampires, so that's probably going to be important. And then we have this. Before you, Bella, my life was like a moonless night, very dark, but there were stars, points of light and reason. And then you shot across my sky like a meteor. Suddenly everything was on fire. There was brilliancy, there was beauty. When you were gone, when the meteor had fallen over the horizon, everything went black. Nothing had changed, but my eyes were blinded by the light. I couldn't see the stars anymore, and there was no more reason for anything. All right. Now here we have their similes, but a lot of times this is called a mixed metaphor because we have a couple different things going on. But this simile of a moonless night where there are stars and reason, and then she comes in like a meteor, everything's on fire, there's brilliancy, and when you're gone, everything goes to black. So it's this extended comparison here in this paragraph of his life before, her effect on him, his life after. And there are quite a number of similes and metaphors and comparisons. This use of figurative language in some of Stephenie Meyer's work here. Here you can just see two examples of it, but you can find many more. So that's part of her style. Another part of her style is, I believe, why a lot of teens are attracted to this book and many adults do not care for it as much. Whether you think it's well written or not, you have to admit that at least for a certain period of time when they first came out, this was quite a sensation. They were best-selling books, and a lot of teenagers and young adults read them. So why is that? Well, I think because she's not just using this figurative language in terms of what the sky looks like as they're sitting out. It's a comparison to how these characters are feeling. So what we end up with is a lot of organic imagery and a lot of emotion and angst that I think really does speak to readers of a particular age. It did not to me because I read them as an adult, and I'm not in that. I wasn't the target audience. I'll put it that way. I wasn't the target audience, but there are things that I did appreciate that she's doing in terms of her writing. In this book, Edward and Bella break up for a period of time, and there is a lot of. And I think this first passage is one of these. The clock is ticking. She's sitting there pining away for him, and we get pages of how she's feeling, what she's thinking, how she wishes he were back, how she doesn't feel like she has a life without him. And then he returns to her, and they have this second conversation here where essentially you find out that he feels the same way. So some things you can learn from this. Using figurative language, having organic imagery, as well as using some comparisons to bring some visual imagery that connects with the organic. So how they're feeling connects with these visual things of a moonless night and then a meteor flashing through and the brilliancy of that on your eyes, and et cetera, et cetera. And a strange comparison too that I think is really interesting up in the first example. the second hand of a clock ticking, like your pulse like the pulse of your blood. I think that's an interesting comparison and not one that we would maybe normally make. So going beyond typical comparisons that we see all the time, that are used all the time, those are what you can learn from this author's particular style. And I think too, you can see, again, like with Cormac McCarthy, the style fits the genre and the subject matter and the theme. So we have the blood, we have a moonless night, as opposed to one where the moon is out and the werewolves are running around. Although I don't think they're guided by the moon, but traditionally, right? So the type of language that she's using here still fits with that subject matter, and it fits with some of her themes. So I think that's quite interesting. Dan Brown, The Da Vinci Code. Another book that we could debate whether or not it's written well, but I want to show you some of the techniques that he employs here. So the Da Vinci Code is a thriller and moves along quite quickly. His style is to have a very fast pace. And if you watch the movie, there's a lot of running. There's a lot of running in the movie and a lot of running in the book too. So we have, I want to show you where he speeds things up, how he slows things down, and then how he speeds things back up again. That is part of the style of the book. So here we go. The agent gave a dire sigh and slid a Polaroid snapshot through the narrow opening in the door. When Langdon saw the photo, his entire body went rigid. This photo was taken less than an hour ago, inside the Louvre. As Langdon stared at the bizarre image, his initial revulsion and shock gave way to a sudden upwelling of anger. Who would do this? We had considered that you might help us answer that very question, considering your knowledge in symbology and your plans to meet him. Langdon stared at the picture, his horror now laced with fear. The image was gruesome and profoundly strange, bringing with it an unsettling sense of déjà vu. A little over a year ago, Langdon had received a photograph of a corpse and a similar request for help. 24 hours later, he had almost lost his life inside Vatican City. This photo was entirely different, yet something about the scenario felt disquietingly familiar. The agent checked his watch. My captain is waiting, sir. Langdon barely heard him. His eyes were still riveted on the picture. This symbol here, and the way his body is oddly positioned, the agent offered. Langdon nodded, feeling a chill as he looked up. I can't imagine who would do this to someone. Okay, so this is from the very beginning of the book, the first chapter. And Langdon appeared in Dan Brown's previous book, Angels and Demons, although this one kind of hit better, and then Angels and Demons was almost like republished. So even though it's the prequel, a lot of people think that it's a sequel, but it's not. But we have short paragraph, short paragraph, short paragraph. These paragraphs that are just 1 to 2 sentences, right? Even here where it's a tiny bit longer, it's because there's dialogue. Then, because this is both the exposition and the inciting incident, it's a thriller, we want to get right to the action, right? We have a longer paragraph, and there are 2 things going on here. The first is that we want to describe the image that he's seeing and to give a little bit of detail, because this dead body is setting off the action of our story, and it's going to be quite important. Then we have this background information to remind the reader, even if they haven't read it, to remind the reader, there we go, of the other book. And so he slows down in this long paragraph to really push the point of how grotesque this body is and the guy looking at this picture, right? And then he gives you the background information that you might need to know to set up a little bit of where the character is now, where he's been, and how he's being drawn into this story. Then we speed back up again. Sentence, 3 sentences, 1 sentence, 1 sentence. Now, what I find interesting here is that you could have, in a different style, you could have had Langdon's saying he's oddly positioned. I can't imagine who would do something to this to someone, and then you can have him, feeling that chill, right? I forget what the sentence said exactly, but he felt a chill go down his spine, something like that. Then, though, you would have a relatively, compared to the rest of it, a relatively longer paragraph after you've just had a longer paragraph. The author doesn't want to do that. So instead, he's doing this back and forth between Langdon and the agent to increase the tension a tiny bit. So, what you can learn from this, one of the reasons that this book was quite popular is because the action was at the forefront. This is a plot-driven story. It moved along quite quickly. There were some twists and turns, and I know a number of people who read this book even though they don't really read books, and that's okay. They enjoyed the story. I don't want to be a literary snob and say don't read. I read the book. It was okay. I don't usually like thrillers, but I did find myself surprised at some of the twists and turns. I'll put it that way. And a lot of times, reading as much as I do, surprising me is kind of difficult to do in a thriller or a mystery. So, stylistically, when do you want to speed up the action and have some shorter sentences to move the audience along? The dialogue here has a purpose. The dialogue is intimately connected with this action because we're starting things off. You can see the agent checks his watch. He mentions to him a couple times, the captain's waiting. I got to get going. We just want an answer from you. Can you come with us? Can you not? And then let's go and let's start this adventure off, right? So yeah, I think there's a lot to learn here about pacing, and again, the sentence structures, the paragraph structures, and how that connects to the story. I think that's, with all three of these so far, that's the important thing, that your style and your story kind of match up. So let's take a look at Mark Twain, The Innocents Abroad. Now, this is actually from a piece of creative nonfiction, but I wanted to grab it because I think it's funny, and also it's from, really, it's not as well known now for Mark Twain, but at the time it was his most celebrated work when it came out. A lot of people only had this book and the Bible at home. So here we go. This is about people in the United States after the Civil War going over to Europe and being kind of the beginning of this stereotype of ignorant Americans who are rougher and less refined than the Europeans. And Mark Twain is playing into that stereotype. So here's what he says. The gentle reader will never know what a consummate ass he can become until he goes abroad. I speak now, of course, in the supposition that the gentle reader has not been abroad and therefore is not already a consummate ass. If the case be otherwise, I beg his pardon and extend him the cordial hand of fellowship, and call him a brother, for I shall always delight to meet an ass after my own heart when I have finished my travels. So, he is talking in the first person, but Mark Twain has this style of narrative intrusion where the narrator has this tone of a little bit mocking of a tone, a little bit certainly humorous, possibly a little bit sarcastic, and he uses here, where's the third one? There it is. I think the word ass is used 3 times in this short paragraph. And what is he doing? This is almost the very beginning of the book. It may even be the opening paragraph. I cannot recall, but you are having a narrator who is basically making fun of your reader and calling your reader an ass, and your reader is presumably really enjoying this kind of treatment. We also have, just I think because of the time period, but also stylistically, some of these larger words that we might not beg his pardon, cordial, supposition. So we have a little bit of a heightened vocabulary here. And also some longer sentences than we just saw. We have from here all the way to here. That's one sentence. So in terms of sentence structures, medium, long, medium, okay? In terms of vocabulary, a little bit heightened, but really you can see the tone that is used by the narrator in this and in other works, and the breaking that fourth wall and talking directly to the reader instead of just narrating what's going on. This is called narrative intrusions. It wasn't unusual in the 1800s for narrators to break through the story and talk to the readers directly, so that's a stylistic choice we don't see as much now that we saw then. So, whoops. Sorry. So we would have things like, gentle reader, you shall hopefully not look upon these people with too much disdain. You have that kind of a thing. If you ever read Uncle Tom's Cabin, there's a number of narrative intrusions to talk about the horrors of slavery that kind of break through the story. So he's doing a couple things here. Things you can learn. Tone. Even if you're not going to be humorous, how can you have a tone that is carried through your entire work, and how can you have that be consistent? When do you want to have a little bit higher vocabulary? You know, the thing here of extend to him the cordial hand of fellowship as contrasted by the consummate ass. These are two things that are really almost in opposition to each other, and pairing them up is brings out that humor even more. So yeah, stylistically quite a bit different from this, right? Here we're concerned more with the action and moving the plot along, and here we're taking time to set the tone, set the mood for the reader, to let them know that we're going to be making fun of these people who are traveling abroad and that they can join in the fun. Ernest Hemingway, The Sun Also Rises. Now, Hemingway is known for shorter sentences that are to the point. I think that sometimes people think that means that you can't have imagery, but imagery does not always have to be long, flowery, descriptive sentences. So stylistically, what I'd like you to notice here, how he's using shorter sentences that are to the point and yet still create an image for the reader. So here he is in France, and I am going to probably not pronounce some things correctly, but we'll give it a try. In the morning, I walked down the boulevard to the Rue Soufflot for coffee and brioche. It was a fine morning. The horse chestnut trees in the Luxembourg Gardens were in bloom. There was the pleasant early morning feeling of a hot day. I read the papers with the coffee and then smoked a cigarette. The flower women were coming up from the market and arranging their daily stock. Students went by, going up to the law school or down to the Sorbonne. The boulevard was busy with trams and people going to work. So the narrator here is describing things. You can kind of get this sense of what it looks like. You also have a tone that is very relaxed. It's a fine morning. It's a hot day. I'm going to read the paper, have a coffee. The women who sell flowers are coming up. The students are going to the law school, and I'm just kind of observing all of this stuff. But if you notice, we have a pretty distinct rhythm. I did a quick word count, so I'm going to highlight these in different colors. We've got 14 words, and then 5. Let's do that in green. And then we have this sentence, and this sentence that are all 11 to 12. And then we have another one that's 14. And then another 14, and then another, I think this is 11 or 12. So, other than the one very short sentence, this kind of keeps the same rhythm. He's not swapping up too much. We have these surprisingly medium length sentences, but the rhythm that he's creating, unlike the stuff we saw from Dan Brown, where it's very like punctuated, unlike the stuff from Mark Twain, where he's very verbose and kind of has this style of running on and describing things in great detail for comic effect. I think that the medium sentences here add to the mood that's created for the reader, the atmosphere of this very gentle day. I'm going to take this off now for those of you whose eyes it's hurting. There we go. But yeah, the rhythm here. There is an app online called the Hemingway app. You can use it for free, and you can put in your work, and it cuts out unnecessary words. So adjectives, adverbs, descriptive words don't necessarily need to be in there. What do I mean by that? Well, terms of style, he has that here. He has that he smoked a cigarette. Do we get the little tendrils of smoke coming up wafting from the cigarette as the air fills with a gray haze? No, we do not. Do we get the specific taste of the coffee and its bitterness mixed with the sweetness of the sugar, and I pour more cream on it to create a lovely, I don't want to say tan because that's not a great word for that, but fawn colored drink. The deliciousness of the coffee, whether it has a hint of cinnamon. No, we don't get all of that, right? We don't get what the flower women exactly look like. Now, we're going to look at Jane Austen in a minute, and if we had her talking about this scene, some of those details would be in there, particularly the clothing. What exactly are the flower women wearing, and how do those outfits compare to the ones of the protagonist, and who is filled with ruffles, and yet these women in their calicos, maybe, whatever the case may be. You would get what their hats look like. You would get who made the coffee and the brioche, if many times in Austen we are in a domestic scene and not in a cafe. He doesn't have all of that here. So, but you have this beautiful imagery, but it's not packed full of words, right? It's not packed full of words. So, things you can learn from Ernest Hemingway's style. How to say a lot using a short number of words, how to structure things so that the rhythm it creates a pleasant or matches the scene that you are in. Many times he will have sentences that are 8 to 14 words long, so he kind of stays in that rhythm all the time. You don't necessarily have to do that. Maybe what you learn from him is that you like switching up the rhythm of your sentences, and that's part of your style. But you can hopefully see stylistically how his diction, his sentence structure, the rhythm, the word choices, how that kind of all works, and how tone and mood are part of that. Quite different from Mark Twain, who we just looked at, with longer sentences and higher level of vocabulary and things of that nature. A totally different tone, obviously, too. I'm not going to read the whole thing here. I'm going to jump from the beginning, and then we'll take a look at the end and we'll talk about it. So this is the beginning of Pride and Prejudice, and we have a sense of humor here, but much more gentle than Mark Twain. So two authors who have sort of a similar tone, but one is quite biting and sarcastic, and one is a little bit more gentle. She's really part of this world that she's writing about, and so the narrative voice, although it's not the author herself, there is a narrative voice, but the narrative voice is gently, not mocking exactly, but enjoying the scene, I will put it that way, and laughing along with the reader at the humorous things that are taking place. So It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of good fortune must be in want of a wife. However little known the feelings or views of such a man may be on his first entering a neighborhood, this truth is so well fixed in the minds of surrounding families that he is considered the rightful property of someone or other of their daughters. So it sets up our scene, it sets up the tone. We have much longer sentences here. The British spelling of neighborhood, which is driving me crazy a little bit, but that's okay. There we go. Well, Americanize it. Longer sentences, little bit higher vocabulary, and then we come into the scene of Mrs. Bennet asking her husband, who she's calling Mr. Bennet, which I find kind of funny. She's asking him if he knows who has just moved in. And he says that he does not know. And then he finally says, well, you want to tell me, and I have no objection to hearing it. And then the narrator says, that was invitation enough. Meaning he gave her enough of an invitation saying he has no objection. And then the narrator jumps in, and then Mrs. Bennet tells him everything she knows and everything she's hoping for and who this person is and how he might be rightful property of one of her daughters at some point. And so, yes, stylely, in terms of the style, we have quite different characterization, right? Then we have an emphasis on different things within the story, and we don't see it here, but these domestic matters. There is some talk, I don't know if it's this book or if it might be Emma, in Jane Austen. I think it's Emma, where one character is very concerned with how much lace is at a wedding, and that dress had too much lace, and that dress didn't have enough, and there has to be just the right amount, and that kind of thing. So what people are wearing, who they are talking about, what the home looks like, the feel of each of these homes, the feel of each of these families, that is part of this style. And the gentle humor as opposed to the biting humor, the places where we have longer sentences and then the dialogue is a little bit shorter, but where do we have that rhythm change up? The narrative voice, the tone, the mood here are quite different, and again, fits the story, right? But in terms of style, I would say there is a large degree of realism in those domestic details. So that you feel like this could happen, unlike something like New Moon, or maybe we don't have those. A little bit of parody and a little bit of exaggeration, a little bit of verbal irony, a lot of... it's a comedy of manners, and so that is part of her style. Realism, humor, and all that kind of added in. So, as I said before, the details in a book are part of an author's style, and certainly for her that is true, and the narrative voice as well. The tone created. I'm not going to read this whole thing either from Stephen King, but we'll jump into the second paragraph just for our time purposes. This is from the book It. In the book, unlike the movies, which I think got things wrong in terms of structure, although the made-for-TV movie did not. But anyway, in the book, we go back and forth between these 12-year-olds who are fighting the evil clown thing, terrorizing their town, and we flash forward to them as adults coming back together and having a reunion of sorts to fight it again. And so Richie here, I believe as an adult, is thinking about what happened to his childhood. And here is what he says. First, somewhere between 18 and 24. That's what he's thinking about. Maybe Richie thought, that's the scary part. You don't stop being a kid all at once, with a big explosive bang, like one of that clown's trick balloons with the Burma-shaped slogans on the side. The kid in you just leaked out like air out of a tire, and one day you looked up in the mirror and there was a grown-up looking back at you. You could go on wearing blue jeans, you could keep going to Springsteen and Sager concerts, you could dye your hair, but that was a grown-up's face in the mirror just the same. It all happened while you were asleep, maybe, like a visit from a tooth fairy. So what we have here, I think quite interestingly, is a moment of great emotion in the middle of what is essentially a horror novel. And I think that one of the reasons that Stephen King's books hit and sell and are made into movies and are remembered by readers more than many other horror books is because it's not just about monsters. His style has a great degree of nostalgia. We have in this book children from the 1950s, and then there are adult versions in the 1980s. So we have a little bit of that 1980s detail, but we also have this idea here. I'm going to put this in blue. That the real thing to be afraid of is not the clown. The real thing to be afraid of is losing your childhood and growing up. And that's the thing that's actually scary to people. And so I think it's very interesting to look at this style. Now, sometimes Stephen King has a number of sentence fragments, like Cormac McCarthy. Here we do not. We have some longer sentences, and we have some similes, like one of the clown's trick balloons. We have like air out of a tire. We have like a visit to a tooth fairy. So we're mixing our similes here, but I think they kind of work. It's a grown-up's face in the mirror. And so a little bit of figurative language, a lot of nostalgia, heavy nostalgia, and that sense of bittersweet, that bittersweet sense of nostalgia, the tone that's set, the mood that's set for the reader, the details there of Springsteen concerts, and so there's some things here with sentence structures, and certainly if you read his other things, you can kind of look for that. But I think the tone is something found in many of his books, and the wish for a more simple life. Much different, actually, than the conventions typically of this genre. So I think what you can learn from him, too, is when to break the conventions and when to go kind of against what the typical conventions would be. In a horror novel, you don't get a lot of times these scenes of emotion. It's two kind of medium-ish longer paragraphs. It may have all been one paragraph. I don't know if I cut it apart just for our purposes. But pause, a break in the action. And what I also find interesting is that this final comparison to a tooth fairy, it all happened while you were asleep. There's a magical being here. There's a magical being coming in and visiting a child in their house while they're asleep. Now, on the one hand, it does seem nostalgic, like, oh, remember when you believed in the tooth fairy? On the other hand, we have a clown who is murdering children and coming in to their houses sometimes and pulling them in through sewers and terrorizing them in the streets. And so this kind of hint also, even within this soft, nostalgic, realistic moment, that still something not quite right here. We get that hint at the end. So I think in terms of style, when to play with the rules, when to break the rules, when to add some emotion to your story. Those are some of the things that he's doing here. And I think it's quite... And when to have... I think this is all one... this is all one sentence. So when to have, in that slowing down, have some of those longer sentences. I think this one might, nope. This one is a little bit longer as well. Right. So, yeah. So it's kind of interesting if we look at the Dan Brown book that really moves along, and then has a few moments of a little bit longer, but still keeping that action up. Here, we're kind of taking a break from the action completely, making sure that that tone is there, that sense of a desire to return to childhood in some way is there, connected to the story, certainly, but many of his books have this tone, and it's not quite as apparent that it's connected to that those plot points. So, what can you do to develop your own style as we're looking at other people's? As a writer, number one, my first tip is just to see what comes naturally. Write and see what comes out. There are certain things that you might do. I am a person, if you cannot tell from these lectures, who likes to talk a lot. And I have a lot of thoughts, and my sentences are very often longer, and then I have to go back and edit them because it's sometimes too long. See what comes out naturally. Do you have longer sentences? Do you kind of write in shorter sentences? Are your ideas more fantastical? Are they more realistic? Like Jane Austen, you have those details of realism, that verisimilitude. Or are you working towards something that the reader kind of really has to stretch their imagination? Do you have a certain rhythm to the way that you talk that comes out in the way that you write? Do you have certain vocabulary, certain diction? My first book, I used the word just. Like, I think I mentioned this before, but it's a book that was about 150 pages, and I think I used the word just 120 times, so almost once per page, and I had to cut that out. But that's something apparently I say more than I think I do, and that kind of thing. But do you have those things, those vocal, I think every person has some vocal tics, some writing tics, things that come out of you naturally. See what happens. Then, number two, learn the rules of standard written English. I don't love using that term, but learn those rules and consider when to follow and when to break. Now, a great book on this is one by Strunk and White called The Elements of Style. It's not about style in the way that we're talking about. It's really more about standard written English and technique and things like colons and semicolons and where to have a comma and subject-verb agreement, I think, might be in there, and all of those things. So it's a great little tool. Talks about how to cut unnecessary words, so a little bit of style, I guess. How to have a stronger verb instead of a verb with an adverb. All of those types of things. It's a great book. I highly recommend it. It's not that big. It's not that much money. It's not that long. So yeah, but if you know the rules of standard English, then you can decide when to break them. If you think about Picasso learned classical painting before moving into his blue period, his rose period, before becoming known for Cubism, where he broke all the rules of painting. Because you have to know things like depth, composition, color, right? You have to know all those things. And it's very similar in English. You don't want to be misspelling things by mistake. You want to maybe have a character who can't write very well and they're misspelling things on purpose. That would be a time where you could break that, right? You don't want to have sentence fragments for no reason. Think about Cormac McCarthy. He has sentence fragments, but they're adding to that story and they're part of the style that he has decided to use for that book. The third, understand the elements of fiction and the genre in which you're writing, or the subgenre in which you're writing, and then again, when to, I won't say break, experiment, with those elements. So again, elements of fiction, plot, characterization, tone, mood. We just talked about Stephen King having a different tone than you would expect for that genre, right? And that, in his case, is very successful. That's something that you can learn from, but certainly kind of understanding those elements, which is why this is part of the class, to teach you about those elements, and then you can kind of play around with them a little bit. Similarly, I'll just put as well as figurative language and other literary techniques. So those are things like simile, metaphor. We saw Stephanie Meyer using some of those. We saw Stephen King using some of those. So having some similes in there, mixing the similes, figuring out, having an extended metaphor that goes on for a couple pages. Number 5 is to read and then read more. Why? Because it goes along with number 6, imitate and experiment. I think it is not bad when you are a new author, an emerging author, and maybe these are things that you decide not to publish. I have a lot of things where I copied some people's styles and I put them in a box because I was younger and I didn't really know what my style was kind of going to be. But I have a number of short stories that are written almost like beat poets. The beat poets I discovered in, I don't know, maybe around 9th or 10th grade, and I got very pulled in by them. But stylistically, what did I keep from that? The sense of rebelliousness maybe against society, or at least the sense of discomfort with or dislike of certain aspects of society, the willingness to talk about difficult subject matter, the willingness to experiment with form, those kind of things. So that's what I mean. You can imitate and experiment and then eventually come to a place where you're inspired but not imitating. Inspired by someone but not imitating them. But certainly when you're starting off, I know a few people who have done this. They look at their favorite authors and they want to write in that same genre, and they kind of use similar techniques and have a little bit of a similar style, and eventually they come to a place where even if they're still writing in that genre, the things that they're writing sound more authentically them and less like fan fiction. And so those are my 6 tips for developing your own style. See what comes naturally, learn the rules of standard written English, learn the elements and understand the elements of fiction as well as figurative language, play around with them, figure out when you can kind of break them or bend those rules, when you need to follow those rules. Think about reading different people, imitate them, and then experiment and maybe come to a place where you're inspired. You can also do some basic things like playing around with your sentence structures, taking a paragraph or a page or a chapter you've written and changing the point of view or changing the tone or trying to create a different mood for the reader. Figuring out what works best for your particular story. Maybe you use one style in one story and a different style in another story. All of those kind of things. So I hope that you have learned a little bit about style today, and I hope that you can take some of these things with you into this week and then into your other writing later down the road. Thanks, everyone.